Hi, this is Rick Manning, President of Americans for Limited Government, coming to you in live stream. We did something a little different with this one. We scheduled it well in advance and set up a special topic that we want to talk about that isn't necessarily a topic that's a immediate shiny object, but something that actually is fundamental to our really returning our country to being controlled by the people, the voters, rather than by the administrative state. And so I wanted to just take this little bit of time talking about that and answer some questions along the way. There's a saying when Donald Trump ran for president. Well, first of all, let me give you a little bit about my background. I did work in the Bush administration, the W administration, the Labor Department, for 2.5 years. That's my administration experience. And it was a labor department. We didn't deal with the federal workforce in terms of the laws. But subsequent to that, we became as Americans for Limited Government, we obviously are very interested in the administrative state and how it works. About 6 years ago, we picked up on an initiative dealing with the Merit Act, which was we had a problem and country had a problem. This is actually 10 years ago. The VA, Veterans Administration, was essentially not treating veterans. They were letting people die on the streets. And some places, like in Phoenix, it was worse than others. But it was a direct result of a federal bureaucracy that rewards time served rather than actual competence. And as a result, we had a terrible situation where people were literally dying without treatment. And these people were our veterans. It was horrific. And so that was occurring. And over time, by 2017, legislation passed with Donald Trump signing it, which changed the Veterans Administration laws and allowed for incompetent, lazy, or recalcitrant employees to be fired in an expedited fashion. And that was a massive break and the stranglehold that the civil service, that the administrative state, the civil service laws have created, had over the basically the country, where once hired, it's almost impossible after a year of service to fire them. So that kind of is part of what was an impetus for me in particular to really take a hard-edged look at what can be done to rein in the administrative state, what can be done to deal with the civil servants, who a vast majority of whom want to do a good job. And my experience with them was, by and large, extremely positive. There were some examples that were less than positive, but I will tell you that this is not an attack on civil servants as a whole. This is an attack on a system that allows for people to stay in jobs and be promoted and get more money, who aren't doing anything and are basically stealing money from the American taxpayer. And so let's just be clear. This is really about making it so we limit government by taking those who are stealing our money by not doing their job and getting rid of them, as opposed to and then creating the civil servants to be neutral, as they're supposed to be, as opposed to being the politically weaponized body that they have become because of some placements at the top of the civil service charts and the SES rank and in a lot of the attorneys at DOJ. So, but let's just focus on the pieces that we're going to talk about. Today, what I'm going to do is I'm going to talk about some very specific things that have occurred, but I'm also going, very recently, by the way, but I'm also going to talk about a little bit about the work from home aspects of this and some of those things. I think most people would be surprised to learn that the federal bureaucracy still isn't back to work. The rest of the country is back to work. The pandemic's over, but here in Washington, D.C., nope, not so much. Which is a good, can be a bad thing, can be a good thing, but we'll talk about it. But I think where I want to start is with a basic premise, and that is Donald Trump ran in 2015, 2016 talking about draining the swamp. It's the one piece of his promises that he wasn't able to actually get done. It's the one piece, and as a result, we have a system. The swamp actually drained Donald Trump. The swamp ran a coup against Donald Trump for 4 years, and quite honestly, continues to do the same today with the J6 Commission. So ultimately, the swamp is a combination of the federal bureaucracy, and all of the private sector support systems around the federal bureaucracy, the consultancies, the lobbyists, and the like. We're focusing on the administrative state, the actual civil servants who work for the public. I think the rest of it kind of takes care of itself if we mitigate the vast amount of influence and power that they have. And the EPA, West Virginia versus EPA case, which we talked earlier about in an earlier podcast, goes a long way to curtailing their power. But so let's talk about what this means, what this looks like. Ultimately, we ran a campaign 5 years ago, 6 years ago, called "You Can't Drain the Swamp Unless You Can Fire the Swamp." And that campaign was focused around expanding the Veterans Administration change in law under that VA reform, which allowed for incompetent, lazy, or recalcitrant federal employees to be fired on an expedited basis. It does not deny those employees due process under the system. It just creates a system where the due process doesn't take a year, 2, 3, 5, 10 years to get through the process. Instead, it's an expedited system. And as a result, we didn't see mass firings of the VA. We've seen an increase in firings of the VA, but we didn't see mass firings of the VA. What we saw was people left, people transferred out. We got people left that system. And so what you're going to end up with, if you expand this, take this and you expand it to government wide, is you'll end up with a percentage, not a huge percentage, but a percentage, probably less than 1% of the overall federal workforce being able to be fired. And that has an impact, because when people see that their colleagues can be fired and they know they can be fired, you know what happens? They come to work. They do work. They're much more responsive to not just to the political appointees, but to their bosses who are in the federal civil service, who basically, depend on the people who work for them to do their job. So it just makes the system work better when people have a little bit of a sense that if I don't actually do my job, I can be fired. You and I have to deal with that. So it seems logical that a federal worker should have to deal with that also. So that's essentially what the Merit Act is. And we'll talk a little bit about that later. But that's how we kind of worked our way into this, is saying, gee, we need to do something. And what they did, the VA, the Veterans Administration, makes sense. Let's expand it across the scope of government. I'll tell the story about what happened with that and why it didn't occur during the Trump administration, even though Donald Trump signed off on it. I'll tell that story a little bit here. But to understand the problem we have with a weaponized federal service system, you have to understand that President Obama changed the nation's civil service system dramatically through an executive order in 2013. That executive order changed the way you hire people coming into the civil service system. You still have tests and all those things, but it also added, well, gee, if somebody sends a resume in, a hiring person can hand the resume over and say, hey, I'd really like for this guy to get a shot, and gets rid of all the roadblocks that truthfully were put in place to make it so that exact thing didn't happen. Even though they excluded a lot of really great people from being part of the civil service, because truthfully, it turned the roadblocks put in pre-Obama change made it so unless you were an insider civil servant, it was extremely difficult to be able to work your way through the human relations system to get to to be considered for a job. So Obama's change, which he did administratively, his change probably was not a bad idea except for the way he did it is it ended up creating the opportunity for all of those people who couldn't be fit into the political appointments, because there's only about 4,000 political jobs, were flooded into the civil service system for permanent long-term jobs where they couldn't be fired. And so as a result, those people now 8 years later are now have been promoted. They've been moved up the scale. They know how things work, and they were the heart of the attacks on Donald Trump that we saw during the Trump administration. So just understand that's what Obama did. That's the net effect of that. And as opposed to what the President Trump came in saying he wants to drain the swamp. The problem was he didn't have a plan to drain the swamp. It was a slogan, but there was no plan behind it, because unlike a private business, you can't just fire people. There's a huge process, and it's a process that is very arduous to get there. And so hence the slogan, you can't drain the swamp unless you can fire the swamp. David, would you put up the little cartoon, and as long as we're doing that, and then I'm going to talk about the actually. So we did this little cartoon you see here. Is one of many things that we've done on the Merit Act. We spent 2 years working really hard on that thing, but it kind of writes itself once you understand that public employees aren't responsive unless they fear being fired, and hence and when you include the political weaponization, you have a group of people who are totally unaccountable, and they're supposed to be the neutral lever pullers in government, whereas the political appointees are supposed to say the direction. The president sets the direction. The political appointees are supposed to convey that direction to the civil servants, who then essentially you say, okay, we're going to go. If you're on a ship, you say, okay, we're going to go starboard. Well, somebody has to actually pull the levers to make the ship go starboard. Well, the lever pullers weren't pulling the levers, and hence the ship didn't go starboard. So that's kind of the process. Let's talk about something that's happened in the last couple of weeks that kind of prompted us to want to have this talk right now. At the Homeland Security Agency, at Health and Human Services, at the time in 2020, at the time when we had we were in the midst of the pandemic. The pandemic started in January, February, December, October. Sometime in 2019, the pandemic actually started in China through the Wuhan lab, and it ended up in America. We ended up having all of 2020 consumed by the COVID pandemic. And it may be shocking to learn this, but the chief of staff of the Health and Human Services asked for an audit to be made of his employees there. And was a political appointee. He said, we need an audit of our employees. And that audit of his employees, which was delivered to him in January of 2021, when the administration was leaving and there was nothing they could do about it, he got the audit. And what it showed is 25% of the Health and Human Services employees, the very people tasked with overseeing a vast majority of the fight against the pandemic, 25% of them never even logged onto their computer in the 10 months of the audit. Let me repeat that. 25% of the Health and Human Services employees who were tasked with actually fighting the fight on the front lines against the pandemic never even bothered to log on to their computer during the 10 months, those 10 months that were audited. I'm sorry, but that's a definition of a non-essential employee if you didn't log in for 10 months. Now, they all got paid. Okay, let's be clear. They all got paid. The average pay of a federal employee is over $90,000 a year. So in 2020, it was $90,000 is how much they got paid on average. Okay. So and when you say 25% of health, if you expand this and assume that that was true throughout the federal bureaucracy, that Health and Human Services, which was at the point of the spear of the COVID, and if 25% there didn't log in, you can assume 25% across the government didn't log in. That means 500,000 people didn't log in 2020. 500,000 people times 90,000 over a course of a year is $45 million, or $45 billion. I'm sorry. $45 billion of employment costs, not counting the health insurance, not counting the retirement, not counting any of those other costs, just straight salary. That's how much money was stolen from the federal treasury by those who did not log in. Now, recognize I'm extrapolating two things. I'm extrapolating the 25% at HHS to government-wide, which may not be fair. And I'm extrapolating that I'm assuming that they all made the average salary and that there was no salary dispersion. Averages are based upon, you've got the people at the highest end, you've got the people at the lowest end. And so I'm assuming that it's the average salary. But I think those are fair assumptions. So when you look at it, in 2020, we had $45 billion stolen by federal employees who did not bother to log in. Okay, think about that. Think about what they, and oh, by the way, we don't have an audit for 2021. We don't have an audit for 2022. So if they didn't log in 2020, what are the chances they logged in 2021? Well, there are chances they log in 2022. I mean, we don't know because there's no audit. And that's what Congress needs to do first. Republicans in Congress need to demand an audit. They need to take this audit that was done out of HHS, and they need to demand in the next funding bill that they fund nothing unless they get an audit of the entire workforce and their login, how many logged in, what happened, what kind of did people get raises who didn't log in? We want to know, did people actually do anything? They might have logged, this was people who logged in 0 times. How many people logged in once a month or logged in once a week? We need real data to determine if people who were entrusted by being able to work at home actually were working at home. And logging in is kind of the basic bare minimal kind of determiner if you did anything. And those are knowable facts. The computer systems, you either logged in or you didn't. It's not an argument about whether you did or not. And that data exists. And so that needs to be a basic bare bones audit of the federal employment system. Because right now, the Pelosi and Schumer are attempting to normalize the work from home environment and make it so basically people don't ever have to come back to work, which has some value, but we'll talk about that in a second. What the Republicans need to do is they need to determine very clearly and make it so we get data about how many people logged in, how many people didn't log in, and who those people were. Because because from that, you can make a case, an objective case, that the American public will absolutely understand that we will win, that there needs to be change. We need the Merit Act. We need to have some other things happen. So in order to drain the swamp, in order to fire the swamp, you have to first audit the swamp. That's first and foremost. It's easy. It's a no-brainer. David, would you put on the would you put on the statement that we are put up the audit one, the 25% HHS, since I just talked about it, if it's not already up. And I understand we're having trouble streaming to Facebook, which is kind of inconvenient since we did this as a Facebook event and kind of tried an experiment with it. But I'm going to continue on with what we're doing, and assume that somebody's seeing whatever we're doing, and we'll have a tape of it, and we'll video it, and we'll send it back out to our lists, whether or not Facebook is able to do this or not. So that's step one. Step one is audit the swamp. It's doable, it's smart, and it's an ask that in the funding bills that I don't know how the Democrats say no. So it's something worth putting a stamp on and forcing it to occur. Quite honestly, the Office of Personnel Management should know this information based upon the fact they're pushing right now a work from home initiative, and presumably they'd want the data as to who is actually working when they work from home. But that's a pretty big presumption from the Biden administration. Basic level of competence would be more than one could expect. So that's a two. The second thing, and this is a tough one to swallow for a lot of people, but as much as it pains me to say this, we need to spend a little bit of money. And that little bit of money needs to be on giving people expanded benefit for retirement. A second Trump administration, or whoever the non-Democrat candidate is who takes over the White House in 2025, needs to come forward with a early retirement plan that is aggressive and gets done in the first 100 days of the administration. And the reason you want to do that, there are about 8,000, let's see, how many are there? There's about, I'm looking on a chart here, which of course, not moving around. There are 7,000 career SES, Senior Executive Service employees in the federal government. Most of them are your more seasoned people. They're the ones who actually are the high-level administrators who pull the levers, who the other careers actually report to. What you don't realize is that the careers don't report to the politicals, except for the secretary. By and large, you have mirrors. For instance, in the Department of Labor in the Public Affairs Division, I had a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs who was in charge of the careers, and a Deputy Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs or Assistant Secretary of Public Affairs who was in charge of the politicals. Presumably, the Deputy Assistant Secretary reported to the Assistant Secretary, but in reality, the Deputy Assistant Secretary was a career and was unaccountable to anybody. So so apart from being able to mess with their money, you really had very little you can do. So you've got this kind of unaccountable branch, and it's run by senior executive service people, about 7,000 of them. So what do? You give them an option for early out. You give people who have been there for a while an option for an early out. You also, by doing that, you expand it across the board. So if somebody is sitting there and they've got 10 years in, but they spent the last 3 years not doing anything, just not even checking in, and they fear that they're going to be fired for that, let them retire early. Let them just take 2 years of retirement and get out. Okay. Bottom line is we want them out of the position without having to expend political capital. And if we're spending $45 billion on people sitting around, let's spend a little money and get them out of the system. That's the objective here. And in terms of the SESs, the objective is to get those who are going to be recalcitrant, who are going to be stopping things from happening, to say, I don't want to be transferred to Bismarck, North Dakota, which you can do with an SES. I don't want to have that occur. Instead, I would prefer to just retire out, opening up those key SES positions for people who actually want to do their job and will implement policy the way it's supposed to on a nonpartisan basis. But you have to get the people who are in the way out of the way. The best way is early out. So it costs a little money, but the fact of the matter is it's the way to do it. And it's something that the the civil service lobbying groups won't, they'll actually be in favor of. So you take that and you attach the Merit Act to it, which we've already discussed, and you put those two together in a piece of legislation and you jam it through. At that point, you've accomplished two things. You're getting rid of people who want to retire. Some good people, some people would be a pain. Some people are just coasting to retirement. You want them out of the way so you can fill those positions of people who are going to do the job. A. B, you get the Merit Act in place. So as part of that deal, so you can then fire those people who need to be fired. That's how you get it done. That's the first 100 days kind of thing. The third obvious thing you want to do is a reduction in force. And a reduction in force means what it says. It's a layoff. And the first people laid off, you basically take people who weren't checking in, and you lay them off. You say, no, we don't need you. And because, once again, that's going to have to be, and you're going to want to structure it in such a way that those people have a hard time getting another government job. That's going to be harder to get through Congress, but if there's enough of a majority, you should be able to jam it through. But that's a third part of the puzzle. It's the hardest piece of the puzzle. But when we know it's why the audit matters. When we know that 25% of the people aren't actually logging into their computer, it's really, really hard to justify those people keeping their job. And we can jam that politically down their throats, down the left's throats, and force them to eat it. But you need the audit done first. So all that audit sets up everything. If you do those things, we can get the people who aren't working out. We can get the people who are recalcitrant out. And we can get the people out, early outs in terms of pensions, by taking their pension and their retirement early and leaving. If we do those things, here's the net result. 85% of the civil service right now votes Democrat. It's possible we could get that down to where only 2/3 of the civil service votes Democrat, not by putting any political barriers in place, but by the people who we would attract in a Republican administration in 2025. Those people would tend to want to work for a Republican administration. So you're going to attract people who are less likely to want to throw sand in the gears and more likely want to do the job of being a civil servant. And that's how we kind of can reinvigorate, refresh the civil service system without having to go through massive civil service reform that will never pass or any of those things. Some very simple, clear-cut things that can be done that are directly on point. Lastly, there's going to be a large discussion and continued ongoing discussion about working from home. And that will be a piece of the puzzle. And one of the interesting offshoots of that is a lot of the buildings that are owned by the federal government, or the federal government uses, I'll use the Department of Transportation as an example. They're in a very, very nice building right by the ballpark, by the Washington National Stadium. It was one of the first buildings built there. It's got a lot of stuff that's grown up around it. The federal government leases that building. And the lease is supposed to be up this year, in the next few years. The point is, do you need to re-up that lease? Well, you may not need to re-up that lease, because if you've got a significant part of your workforce working from home, you don't need as much space. And as a result, you have the capacity to consolidate that space. And that's where having a really smart person from the building field, from the business, from Donald Trump's commercial field, running the General Services Administration, which oversees the buildings, could allow us the ability to consolidate the workforce that's now working from home, a significant portion, consolidate them in fewer buildings, sell the buildings or get out from under leases or sell buildings that we don't need, move some of those employees off to be closer to the constituents they're supposed to serve, and create an environment where the swamp itself is physically reduced in terms of its footprint in Washington, D.C. And by getting rid of those buildings, some of which are just Department of Labor's building, which I worked in, is really not very functional. It's not only not functional, it's not very safe. It's a terrible building. It's an old building. It needs a massive retooling, and it's got a lot of employees that work there. And and I think there's more rats in the building than there are employees, at least when I was there. So so it's not a very great place to work from a physical structure, but it's very simple. It's really simple. If we have fewer employees, then we need less office space. We need less office space. That gives an asset that we can sell or get rid of to help the federal budget. And when we sell the buildings, it makes it harder for them to be filled up with future employees to expand the federal workforce more beyond the 2 million we have right now, and the federal 2.1 million in the federal civilian workforce. So it's very simple. It has a virtuous impact of we reduce the workforce because people are working outside. You get rid of the building space, and that creates money up front. Plus, because this property is valuable. Plus, it provides us with a block against the temptation to fill those empty cubicles with people, while the people who used to fill them are working from home. So it has a dual effect, and that's the General Service Administration piece of this in terms of buildings. But ultimately, that I've laid out what's going to happen, what we can do. It's feasible, something we're dedicated to doing, something we're going to make happen. We're Americans for Limited Government, and it's something that, truthfully, will never be sexy. It'll never be something that people talk about. It'll never be a shiny object, but it's needed. It's the kind of thing that I try to focus in on here at ALG. Pick things that nobody's focusing on that make a massive difference, that will have a massive difference long term when you're successful, and make them happen. And typically what happens is we get in the fight, we start the fight, we want to run as far as we can with the fight, and then you end up with and we do win many of these fights, but because they're kind of undercover, you don't see much about them. Unless we tell you about it, you'll never find out, because quite honestly, they aren't sexy. It's reducing federal workforce. It's a great fundraiser, but in terms of people paying attention, it's a terrible, terrible issue, because it deals with underlying problems as opposed to things that bubble up. Fortunately, we have this Homeland Security audit that shows how bad it is, that allows us to have a shiny object that we can grab a hold of and use to drive the audit, which drives everything else. So that's where we're at. That's what we're doing. Let me take a look at some questions here. Hopefully somebody is out there watching this thing. And David, I can't see the questions because I've got this American for Limited Government thing here. I guess I need to remove this. What's going on, David? David, are you there? Okay, yeah. Okay, so sorry, folks. I had a little user error there. Betsy Burns, didn't they give all federal government free gym? Yes, they did. But if they were in New York City, they weren't able to use them because they shut down all the gyms, as they did with DC. So free gym memberships when no gyms were available was somewhat useless. But yes, the federal government did all sorts of stuff. They gave bonuses. They gave, federal employees got stimulus checks. They got all those different things when they were sitting at home, not working, getting 25% more into logging into the computers. So yes, that it was the pandemic was quite lucrative for the federal employees. In fact, I argued during the pandemic, pretty vociferously during the 2020, that the reason that Dr. Anthony Fauci was so much in favor of shutting down the economy is because the only people who weren't affected were the people who he worked with, because the federal employees weren't affected by the shutdowns, whereas everybody who worked in the private sector was destroyed. So it's very easy in Washington D.C. to shut down the private sector when the people who are actually your neighbors are all still working, I use that term, are all still getting a paycheck, because that's kind of the mentality that occurs when you're a federal employee. None of the people you work with are affected. So let's talk about some other ones here. Republicans have many rhinos voting with Democrats to impeach anyone. Betsy, impeaching, yeah, you're right. The impeachment is always, the fact is, it's almost impossible for the Republicans to get together to impeach anybody. And while the idea of impeaching Biden is, let's face it, if anybody actually looks at the Hunter Biden stuff, it's almost impossible not to. But it is getting the votes in the Senate to convict is a near impossibility. Let's see here. If the Republicans, do you think they will do this? Betsy, you're burying me here. Here's what I know. I know that. Let me tell you what happened in 2018. Maybe it's 2018. I had a lot of support on the Senate side to include the Merit Act as part of the budget, as part of the appropriations process. I got the Merit Act proposal put on, along with the language, put on Donald Trump's desk by a close personal friend of Donald Trump's at the Oval Office. And he signed off on it and said, yes, we want to do this. And unfortunately, his legislative affairs team didn't really want to do it. And as a result, it got buried in the White House. And I was told directly by people in the Senate that if something that they had asked for, if the White House had asked for, they would have gotten it done. But because the White House never asked, it didn't happen. So just one of those frustrations where you get the president to say yes, but his staff vetoed him in the process. And that's all I'm going to say. I believe we'll have the votes for this. That's why the audit's so important. This is politically a no-brainer. And as a result, as a political no-brainer, I think you can get it done. And what's more, the civil servants are going to want the early out. They're going to want the 2 years extended on their pension, so they can, if they've got 28 years, they can retire at 30. They're going to want that. It's a big giveaway to them. So it's going to be very hard for the civil servants, the public employee unions to push against it. And in the face of the Merit Act, I believe the employee unions won't like it, but we're going to conflict them by giving them something they want. You conflict them with something they don't want. And I think we'll be able to push it through because the allure of having benefits expanded one time, not permanent benefits expanded, but trust me, that's going to be really, really hard for the public employee unions to resist. So it's like anything. And by the way, I've explained why it makes sense to do it. So it's something that meets everybody's needs. And that is how you get stuff done in politics. Is you figure out how to meet other people, the opponent's needs. So it makes it harder for them to go to the wall against it. Let's see. Federal government politically channels pork taxpayer dollars through Congress, which gets disguised as programs in schools or services to schools. Very true. It is we have a wash, rinse, repeat system here in DC. And essentially you end up with a program that they get started, and it's a trial program. We're going to do, a paltry $50 million on it. And by the time 10 years is up, that $50 million program becomes a $500 million program or a $5 billion program. And the people who set it up oftentimes end up in working for a beneficiary organization that since they know how to work the system, and they get the grants. And then those same people end up going back into the government to push the grants back out. And it's wash, rinse, repeat. And truthfully, it's why Congress needs to do a better job in the appropriations process, getting back to a system where they're not doing, one big omnibus, but rather doing 13 bills where they're looking at the actual bills and trying to flush out the waste and these kind of grant programs that don't serve any purpose, and what's more, are just literally funding the institutional left. And we forget how much of the money goes to interest groups that are full, unabashed supporters of left-wing politicians. And so the money gets sent out from the taxpayer to them. And then part of that money gets sent back to the politicians. And essentially they're just using their government washing your tax dollars to support left-wing politicians and causes. So beware, anytime any program has advocacy in it, if they say they do advocacy, understand that if they're getting federal government dollars and they're doing advocacy, essentially the federal government is paying them to advocate for expansion of the program that the federal government oversees, so more money can go to that group, so more money can come back to those who used to be in the federal government, who are now benefiting working for the program. It is a terrible system. It is the swamp in many respects. And it's a part of the swamp that a lot of people are trying to deal with, Americans for Limited Government included. But truthfully, it's much harder to deal with. It's episodic in terms of rooting out problems and then dealing with them one at a time. And what we actually need is a sentient Congress that's doing their job in terms of oversight, doing their job in terms of rooting out this kind of corruption and getting rid of those programs that are nothing more than wash, rinse, repeat programs, and getting rid of programs that are obviously far left programs. About 7 years ago, we developed a database, which is subsequently we shut down because there wasn't a use for it. But we developed a database of 200. We had about 200 defunds. It was called defundme.com defundme.com. And it had a lot of things like get rid of Wilson Institute, just one that pops into my brain, which is nothing more than a left-wing advocacy group. And there's absolutely no reason for the federal government to fund it. If they want to be funded, they can go and raise money from left-wing donors. Get rid of no longer fund the Corporation for Public Broadcasting with taxpayer dollars. There's absolutely no reason for NPR and the Corporation for Public Broadcasting to get taxpayer dollars. The reason they exist is because they're a protected class, because quite honestly, a lot of the people, wealthy people who like having public broadcasting available, they're on the public broadcasting boards, and they have an inordinate influence on members of Congress on both the right and the left. So there's a lot of those kind of things we could do a clean sweep of, but recognize Corporation for Public Broadcasting is about a half $500 million expenditure. And when you're spending $4.5 trillion, a $500 million expenditure, $500 million, to put that in context, almost seems like a drop in the bucket. And as a result, you end up with people saying, well, should I expend all this energy to get rid of a $500 million when over here we're spending $40 billion, $50 billion on Ukrainian aid, of which only a portion of it goes to Ukraine and the rest goes to interest groups. So you sit there and you say, which battles are you going to fight? And with 435 members of the House and only, let's say, 100, 200 of them now Republican, you have a real problem in terms of how much time they can spend on programs that quote unquote only spend 400, 500 billion or $1 million when that's such a small amount. But trust me, if we got rid of 10 of those programs a year, 10 a year, within a decade, we would destroy a lot of the strings that carry the administrative state forward and that fund the Democratic majority and fund the left. And so it's an endeavor we fight on. It's an endeavor we push for. We do it every single year. We beat our head against that brick wall every year, and we have to set it up in the next 2.5, 3 years that this will be a priority for Congress, not just in 2023, but 2025. Because if we do, we can get stuff done like this and begin really draining the swamp, both the spending, the wash, rinse, repeat part of the swamp, as well as the personnel part of the swamp. And while this has been focused on personnel, because quite honestly, I think it's the most doable thing that has the most massively sustainable and winnable fight that we have in front of us. And if we don't do it, we're going to lose overall long term. We can't win unless we fix the swamp, the personnel part. But yes, you're right. It's getting rid of some of the grant stuff that's being done it's just sickening. Truthfully, it's just sickening. And I could go on and on about it. Maybe someday I will. Let's see here. What else do we have? There's Robert. Here's what I'm going to do. If you've got any questions, go ahead and post a question now. Otherwise, I'm going to wrap up. And I'm going to wrap up by saying this. Folks, you can do something about this. Okay, you can do something about this. Right now, one of the swamp problems we have is this. We have a Congress that's more interested in playing political games than actually solving the country's problems. The J6 Commission is one of those, is an example of that. Complete political weaponization of a process that's supposed to be honest, an honest inquiry. And it quite honestly does more to, I'll use a term I try not to use, piss me off than virtually anything they're doing, because it's just so craven, and it's what they're doing. So I would urge you to go on just that piece of it. If that makes you mad too, we're going to have a whole campaign we're doing on Drain the Swamp, and we're going to be rolling it out over the next 3 years, but we're going to roll it out first part of it pretty quickly here in terms of audit the swamp. What I need you to do right now, though, is to go to our getliberty.org site, go to the getliberty.org site, click on the J6 Commission button, and we've got a petition to demanding that Kevin McCarthy start fighting back, start pushing back against it. There's been a lot of articles right now today about this, and Axios had one. There's some things that can be done, and we're specifically recommending in one of our petitions, I'm not sure it's the one that's up on the Get Liberty site. On one of our petitions, we're specifically recommending and urging Kevin McCarthy to refer Liz Cheney to the House Ethics Committee, because she put a woman on the stand and essentially was the attorney leading the witness in terms of Cassidy. And so she put her on the stand, knowing full well that everything she said was hearsay, secondhand, and knowing that people who were in firsthand knew exactly what had happened had said it wasn't true. So she suborned perjury. And while throwing this former low-level White House staffer in jail for perjury seems like a pretty attractive thing, but we know that will never happen because the DOJ won't prosecute it. But making Liz Cheney have to be accountable for suborning perjury putting her in front of the House Ethics Committee and subjecting her to a full ethics investigation, that's something which Kevin McCarthy could and should do. And do the same thing with Kinzinger, although he was more of a passive participant in that. Bottom line is, it's time for Kevin McCarthy to put on his big boy pants and get engaged and stop playing around. It's time for Kevin McCarthy, if he wants to be Speaker of the House, he darn well better start acting like he's going to be a leader. And that means ending this farce. And the best way to end the farce is to start making there be political consequences for those who are conducting the farce. And that means just get some guts and take on Liz Cheney, put her before the House Ethics, and let's start fighting back, because I'm sick and tired of the House using their resources to go after President Trump in a third impeachment trial. It's time to get over it. Okay, get over it. The Democrats need to figure it out. And we're not even touching on the travesty of fact people are still in the DC jail being subjected to horrific conditions, still in the DC jail, waiting because they took selfies in the Capitol. And it's the disservice being served by that J6 commission is so grievous that just anybody who's not enraged by it hasn't been paying attention. And quite honestly, we don't write about it enough because it pisses me off so much that it almost causes me not to be able to do anything else. And so we don't spend a tremendous amount of time on it. But I encourage you to do that today by going and getting engaged and urging Kevin McCarthy to take action. GetLiberty.org, push the button on J6 Commission, and you'll be able to do that. With that, I'm going to close this thing out. I just appreciate everybody being on here. We're going to do this pretty regularly. We do these things, a couple, 3 times a week, but we'll have scheduled ones on key big issues that we think matter, that perhaps don't fit the shiny object mode of, hey, this just happened, let's talk about it. And not that a Supreme Court decision is a shiny object. It's just something that's happening right there where it takes immediate response and there's immediate interest. We're going to use this as a tool also to educate people about things that can be done and things that are being done in Washington, D.C. to fix the problems, the underlying problems, the structural problems that are destroying our country. And that's the big picture stuff we do at Americans for Limited Government. And I hope that you'll continue joining us and encourage others to do so, because folks, without you, we can't get it done. And with that, I'll close out and say thank you very much, and God bless America.